I'm Sceery. I produced the following video about predator hunting and calling techniques that I personally developed and that I found most effective. These techniques have been used successfully by thousands of hunters for over 40 years. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Ed Sceery's High Country Outdoor Classroom. Sit back and get comfortable as Ed, one of America's foremost authorities on predator hunting, covers the many hunting techniques that he has developed for using game calls for attracting the predators of North America.
We're about 9,000 feet in the mountains near Gunnison, Colorado. There's a rancher here that's had some coyote problem. It's June now, and the coyotes have been feeding pretty heavily on the domestic calves and the elk calves, and he asked us to come up and help him with his coyote problem. So we're up here for a few days and going to take some of the coyotes off of this ranch and see if that doesn't cut down on some of the calf loss that we've experienced here. This coyote was kind of enjoyable to call up. We just before I called him, I set my stopwatch. I turned it on because I always want to know how long I'm calling, and I started calling this guy, and I squeezed the trigger on him 27 seconds after we started calling. This stance, this coyote was pretty close and came in pretty quick to the call. And after we shot this one, we waited a couple more minutes to let things quiet down from the gunshot, and I howled a couple times and went back and started calling with a variable predator call. And 5 minutes later, another coyote came in, barked real close, and we shot him too. He's across the valley here. We'll go take a look at him later.
You'll learn the hunting methods that Ed originated for successfully calling coyotes, fox, bobcats, bears, and mountain lions. For the past 30 years, Ed has been president and owner of Sceery Game Call Company, which is the largest and best-known manufacturer of predator calls in North America. Ed holds a doctorate degree in animal science and has over 30 years of research and field experience with predators and predator hunting. He is the leader in the development of new predator hunting techniques. Now let's join Ed in the great outdoors.
Hi, I'm Ed Sceery. Predator calling is one of the most exciting hunting sports in North America. There's a major difference between predator calling and some of the other traditional hunting sports, such as elk, deer, and turkey. In predator calling, you convince the animals to hunt you. You become the prey, and the animals hunt you. They're coming in with food on their mind. Now, with calling mountain lions and bears, this can sure get your adrenaline up. Let me give you another example of a difference between predator calling and some of the other traditional hunting sports. When you're hunting deer or elk, typically you want the wind to be blowing from the animals toward you so that they can't smell you. When we hunt predators, what we want is the wind on our back blowing out in the direction that the animals will be coming from. This is the exact opposite as in deer and elk hunting. Using handheld predator calls or portable electronic cassette players, you produce the sounds of prey animals in distress, such as cottontail rabbits or small rodents. The predatory animals are then going to hunt you, and they normally hunt into the wind. They generally use the wind to help find their prey, so most often they'll approach you from a downwind position. Let me demonstrate one of the distress sounds that I make with my VG2 Cottontail distress call. Now, when animals hear that sound, the predatory animals, they will frequently respond by charging in your direction. They may come charging in just a few seconds, or they may take over an hour to show up. There's a wide variety of predators in North America that will respond to predator calling. This includes black bears, brown bears and grizzly bears, mountain lions, bobcats, red and gray fox, and the most common of them all, the coyote. A lot of my discussions about predator calling are devoted to hunting coyotes. And there's several reasons for this. For sheer number of animals, coyotes have got all the other predators beat by quite a margin. They've expanded their range greatly in recent years, and now they occupy and can be heard howling nearly throughout the entire country, from the eastern states to Alaska to Canada and down to old Mexico. The coyote is the smartest and among the most challenging predator to hunt. I believe that if you are an experienced and successful coyote hunter and caller, you'll have no trouble hunting and calling the other predators. There's a growing interest in sport hunting of coyotes, and there's no better way to hunt coyotes than by using a mouth-blown predator call. Hunting seasons on coyotes are open year-long in most areas, and typically there's no restrictions on hunting coyotes. With the expansion of coyotes into the eastern states, a lot of eastern hunters are taking up the exciting hunting sport of calling coyotes. When learning how to call predators, keep in mind the fact that if the hunting technique works for Mr. Wile E. Coyote, it will most likely work for the other predators. One of the great things about predator calling is in many states there are hardly any restrictions on hunting seasons. You'll need to check your local game laws and hunting proclamations, which are available through most game and fish departments. The time of year you go predator calling will make a big difference in the number of animals that will respond to your calling efforts. While you can expect to have success all year long, the fall months are by far the best. In the fall, you can often have some rather exceptional results right after the first one or two hard freezes. So watch for the first frost in the fall, and then plan your calling activities right after that. We enjoy predator hunting and predator calling all year long. In the spring, Mr. Wile E. Coyote has a pretty good appetite. The adult coyotes have to feed their annual crop of puppies, and they particularly enjoy feasting on young lambs and an occasional domestic calf. Coyotes can be particularly hard on deer and elk in the spring. Fox and coyotes can feed quite heavily on the eggs of some of our birds, such as quail, pheasants, and turkeys. What a lot of folks don't know is that coyotes also feed heavily on snakes. The coyotes in the western states particularly enjoy feeding on rattlesnakes. Using a predator call to call in predators is not only real exciting, but it's the quickest, most effective way to get predatory animals close to your location. For those of you working in the line of predator control, using a call and a gun to take coyotes has proven to be the most species-specific, cost-effective way to reduce predation on livestock. For photographers, a predator call is a valuable tool for bringing animals in for some good close photos. Most experienced wildlife photographers carry predator calls, and they use them to get the sharp, alert look on the animals that they're photographing. First, I want to review some of the basic hunting techniques I use for calling predators. Then I'll go over the calling techniques I use to blow on a variety of different predator calls. This would help you with some of the questions you might have about what specific sounds you should be producing with your predator calls. I would strongly urge you to spend some time out observing the animals that you intend to hunt. Large open pastures, big farm fields, and large meadows are good places to search for these animals. In many eastern states, there are large areas of the forests that have been clear-cut to allow for power lines. These are good areas to search. Rivers and creek bottoms in the east and the Midwest provide excellent habitat for fox, bobcats, and coyotes. Find a good vantage point, such as a high hill, or in flat country, use a windmill tower. With a high-power spotting scope, or a pair of binoculars, search the area until you locate the animals. The early morning hours are the best, looking westward with the sun at your back. Do it just after sunrise. Spend as much time as you can observing the animals throughout the year. Study their tracks and sign so that you can learn which kind of country that they prefer. One of the major things that's going to determine how many animals you call is the area you're hunting in. If you plan to hunt and call a lot of varmints, you've got to be in an area that's home to a lot of varmints. If I choose a good area to call, it's not uncommon for me to call upwards of 20 or more animals in a day of calling. Another nearby area may not produce more than 1 or 2 animals for the same amount of time and effort. You need to do some scouting. Drive the back roads and look for tracks and sign. If you don't find much sign, don't expect to call a lot of varmints. One thing I've found is that good productive areas tend to remain that way from year to year. So if you find a good area to call, it will most likely be productive in future years of hunting. Talk to local farmers and ranchers. They can generally point you in the right direction. Another good idea is to talk to experienced varmint hunters in your area, and they can tell you where they've had the best luck hunting. For numbers of animals, I currently call about 1 animal for every 2 stands that I make. Now, a stand is the place that I choose to sit down and call from. To give you an idea of how successful you can be calling varmints, let me mention an annual 3-day fall coyote hunt I've guided for the Safari Club for a number of years. In the past 5 years, the 3-day hunts have totaled 15 days of coyote calling, mostly during the morning hours. In these 15 days, I've called a total of 145 coyotes. Now that's an average of about 10 coyotes a day. During these hunts, the number varied from as few as 1 or 2 coyotes per day to as many as over 20 coyotes in a morning. Now this type of calling response is what I normally expect when I'm hunting in an area that's home to a lot of animals and during the most productive time of year. Of course, this is calling coyotes in some of the best locations of the western states. Hunting in new areas that I'm not familiar with will most often produce fewer animals. You've got to learn from your scouting and hunting experience which areas are most productive and spend your time hunting and calling over those areas. Among the most important thing about learning how to predator hunt is to be a diehard. Don't give up if you're unsuccessful a few times. Keep at it until you succeed. You'll find if you're a novice predator caller, you may, after a few times without any luck, think, well, it's not going to work for you and you ought to quit. But I don't believe that that's true. I think particularly for those of you just learning how to call predators, what you have to do is you have to continue to work at it until you succeed. And I assure you, after a certain amount of time, you're going to have some luck. Now, there's a number of you that are going to be first-time predator callers. You're going to pick up one of the calls. You're going to go out there, and the first time you try it, you're going to have some success. It's going to go to your head, and you're going to think you're a great predator caller. And that's great, but those of you who don't have that kind of success the first time out, don't give up. Keep trying it. Sooner or later, you're going to find it works for you, and it's going to give you some confidence to keep it up. And the more you have success, the more you'll keep at the sport, and your success will build. So I'd encourage you to be a diehard when you're out calling predators. Keep at it until it works for you. A number of times every year, I have hunters call me asking me what kind of firearm, what type of firearm they should use for predator calling. They tell me what they are going to save up some money and buy a good rifle, but they say that the first year they predator call, they're going to use their trusty old deer rifles. Now, these old deer rifles like this Model 94 3030. These are great old rifles, but they just not suited for predator calling. They're shooting bullets that are too big, and they're too slow. They just don't have the good trajectory needed for predator calling. Now, my personal preference for a rifle is a 22 caliber center fire 22-250. This is my personal rifle here that I've got cameled up with camo tape. It's a Ruger bolt action Model 77 22-250. And I consider this a real fine rifle. And I've used many of them. I've used Rugers for many years. This has been a real good rifle for me. Before deciding on what type of weapon you're going to use, you need to understand that your choice of weapon will ultimately determine the success you have in taking predators. The more primitive the weapon you choose, the more challenging the hunt, but the fewer animals you'll end up taking. I don't want to imply that you shouldn't use primitive weapons, as they have their place in many hunting activities. Now, I'm a pretty big fan of bow hunting myself, and I really enjoy predator calling with my bow. Most of the hunting that I do these days myself, other than guided hunts, I do with my bow. This is a 55 to 70 pound PSE Firefly bow. You can see with the wheels and cams, it's a compound bow. I've equipped it with an overdraw. I can shoot shorter arrows at a faster velocity. I also use peep sight and sight pins for my hunting. This has been a real good bow. I've had it a number of years. They've got some newer models out that I think are pretty good. But I think if you take up bow hunting, particularly for predators, you need to get a good bow. I'd suggest an overdraw on the bow and short arrows that you can get the velocity necessary to launch an arrow and get it to an animal pretty quick. So this is the bow that I use. This is my own personal bow. You need to consider your goals and start out with the right type of weapon. If you use anything less, I'm certain you're going to face some disappointment with your hunting success. Basically, for consistently successful hunting, if your definition of a successful hunt is to kill an animal, the best choice of weapon is a modern, high-powered firearm. Now, you may find that either a shotgun or a rifle is best, depending on the type of country you're going to be hunting in. If you're hunting in wide open or relatively wide open spaces, a high-velocity 22 caliber centerfire rifle is about the only way to go. Now, this includes calibers such as a 22-250, a 220 Swift, a 222, or a 223. Now, on the heavier side, you may find that a 243 is acceptable. Now, a 243 works best if you hand-load it and use the lightest bullets that you can find. Most firearms larger than a 243 are not acceptable for the smaller predators. They're just too much firepower. For the larger predators, such as mountain lions and bears, you'll of course be very wise to go to some heavier caliber weapons. Now, the main problem in shooting predators is not getting the bullet from the magazine to the chamber as fast as possible. That's not the problem. The main problem with hunting coyotes and fox and the other predators is getting your crosshairs up and steady on the animal. That's the problem. And so the speed of cranking bullets in and out of the magazine and chamber, that's not the issue. The main thing that you need to be concerned about is holding the crosshairs steady on the animal. And don't be shooting at animals. Let's pick out spots that we shoot at. It's a big mistake, and if you go out and you start shooting at animals rather than taking shots at particular spots on the animals, you won't do very well. You need to learn when you're hunting animals, predators, any animals, that when you aim your rifle or your weapon, you aim it at a specific spot on the animal. Just don't aim at an animal. Typically, if you aim at an animal, you'll miss. Now, after doing this for 30 years, I wouldn't go out predator calling without the steady shooting rest that a bipod will provide. This is a Harris bipod. It's the one that I've used for 30 years, and I'd strongly recommend you take a real serious look at a Harris bipod. These mount real quickly on the detachable sling swivel on your rifle's forearm, and they provide you with a real steady shooting rest. They've got adjustable legs. I think you'll like these bipods, and I would recommend that you shouldn't go calling coyotes or fox without a bipod. One of the biggest problems faced by novice predator callers or those hunters who have just taken up the sport is buck fever. Now, it's real common for an inexperienced predator caller or a novice to the sport to get buck fever. Their heart starts pounding, you get dry mouth, and you start shaking. And I assure you, when you get buck fever, you're not gonna hit a very high percentage of the animals that you call in. You just can't steady your crosshairs of your rifle if you're shaking with excitement. And I guess that's what I can tell you is going to happen to most of you new-time predator callers. It's just part of learning how to become an experienced predator caller is learning how to relax. Now, I'm a big fan of high-powered variable scopes. My personal preference is a 6 to 18 variable scope on my 22-250. And I prefer these large scopes. Normally on a 6 to 18 scope, I normally keep it at about 10 or 12 power while I'm hunting. If I've got an animal that comes in and stops at 250 yards, then I can crank it up to 18 power. If he comes in to 50 yards, just with my thumb, I can crank it down to 6 power, so it gives you a lot of versatility, high power variable scope. Now, I wouldn't recommend anything less than a 4x12. Now, some guys try to get along with a 3x9 variable, but I recommend a 4x12 as a minimum scope for a good varmint rifle. Any successful shot at a coyote or fox out beyond 200 yards, I consider excellent shooting. And I've never met nor have I seen anyone who could consistently call and hit coyotes much beyond 200 yards. Shooting at these distances from a bench with your rifle on sandbags at the range is a piece of cake. But out in a hunting situation, a 200-yard shot is a pretty darn good shot. Out beyond 300 yards, from my experience, it's mostly luck to hit one of the smaller predators, and I don't normally take shots at that distance. Now, shotguns can be very effective on the smaller predators, coyotes, fox, and bobcats. What I recommend you use is a 12-gauge shotgun with 3-inch Magnum shells. My personal preference for a shotgun is a Browning Auto 5 Magnum. When predator calling, every time you miss a shot, you learn something. And over the years, I've missed a lot of varmints, and if you hunt coyotes or fox for very long, I suspect that you're going to miss a lot too. If you figure all the animals that I've missed over the years, and I've learned a little bit every time I've missed some, I think I might be what you call a real educated coyote or predator caller. For stopping coyotes for a good shot, what I've found works best is making a real loud barking or whooping sound. Now, when I've got a coyote running toward me, I center my crosshairs on the animal, and I keep my crosshairs on the animal until he's close in where he gives me a good shot. When I'm ready to take that shot, I stop him by making a loud whoop like this. Whoop! Now, 95% of the time you do that, a coyote will stop dead in its tracks, and most of the time they're broadside to you. Stop dead in their tracks, turn broadside, and they'll look at you for about 2 seconds. They'll figure you're not what they thought you were, and they'll immediately put it in high gear and leave. But if you've got your crosshairs on the animal and you're following him in, you whoop, he stops. All you need is a couple seconds to squeeze off a shot. So practice that on some coyotes and you'll find it very effective. One of the keys to successful predator calling is calling from an area that you can see the surrounding countryside. If you're calling over an area that you can see the countryside, if your calling efforts are productive, you'll see the animal approach you. If you're in real thick brushy country and you call, even if you get an animal to respond, you won't be able to see it. So that's one of the real big keys to calling predators, is to be in an area or call from an area that you have a real good view of the surrounding country. Let's talk a little about some regional differences in predator hunting techniques. Over the past 30 years or so, I've had the opportunity to hunt widely throughout North America. It's my strong personal opinion that there are no major regional differences to the specific hunting methods that should be used in calling predatory animals. Now, I've used the same basic hunting techniques calling fox and coyotes in the eastern Midwestern states that I've used to call coyotes, mountain lions, and bears in the west, in Canada, Alaska, and Mexico. If you learn how to hunt and call predators, I expect you to have good results wherever you hunt in North America. As you learn more about the sport and gain valuable hunting experience, you can expect your results to improve. Now, there's differences in the terrain from one area to another. This holds true no matter where you're hunting, and you may have to make some changes in the way you set up at a stand or in picking your stand location so that it affords you the best view of an area. But your calling sounds and your blowing techniques will not need to be changed because of the specific state or area of the country you're calling in. I've spent a lot of time experimenting and testing different sounds for calling predators. Predatory animals generally feed on the various rabbits, hares, and rodents in an area. Of course, they also feed on many other things, such as plants, insects, and small reptiles. But the sound of the small mammals are what I'd suggest that you stick to. You can also do some coyote howling if you're calling coyotes. Those of you that are interested in howling, I'd strongly suggest you listen to my audio cassette tape, Howling for Coyotes. The most effective distress sounds are produced by blowing erratically on a predator call. Specific blowing patterns or repetitions of the exact same sequence of sounds should be avoided. Make your calling sounds as erratic as you can. When I blow on a call, I try to envision a small injured animal, such as a cottontail or a jackrabbit. And I think it's a good approach to blowing on a call correctly. I believe that the way you produce the sounds is important and will prove over time to have an effect on the number of animals that you fool. For coyotes, I've found that a certain amount of coarseness to the sound tends to produce better results. Now let's listen to the coarse sounds that I get from my Model VG3 Jackrabbit distress call. And now let's listen to the real thing. Let's listen to a recording that I made of a jackrabbit. Let's listen to the higher breaking pitch sounds I can get from my Model VG2 Cottontail distress call. And now let's listen to the real thing of a tape recording I made of a cottontail rabbit. loud should you blow on a predator call? Well, I prefer to blow a call almost as loud as I can blow it. The rabbit distress calls that I make have been designed and tested to exactly match the volume of the various rabbits. Now, rabbits scream very loudly when in trouble, and so I try to mimic this, and I blow loud when using a predator call. Now, we went out and we measured the volume of some rabbits and found that jackrabbits have a volume of about 112 to 115 decibels. And so we designed the calls to produce that same volume. One of the few exceptions to the volume in blowing on predator calls is if you have an animal up close. When you've got an animal approaching your position, avoid loud distress sounds. You've already got him fooled, and he hasn't yet figured out you're a fake. Don't give him any more information to work with. Back way off on your calling if you've got an animal into close range. Or better yet, switch over to one of the quieter coaxer calls. In predator calling, you should make a series of distress cries every 2 or 3 minutes while you're at your stand. Spend the rest of the time searching the area for an approaching animal. Those of you new to predator calling should take a lot of time to practice blowing on these calls. It's going to take you a little bit of time to where you're real good at making the proper sounds from the predator calls. Practice a lot, listen to tape recordings of these animals in distress, and compare your blowing sounds to the tapes of the actual animals. That's a real good way to learn how to make the right sounds. In hunting predators with a call, it's important for you to remain quiet. Most of the hunters I take out calling, even many experienced hunters, don't understand what the word quiet means. It means not making any noise, not talking, not slamming or shutting truck doors, not coughing or sneezing, not moving or shuffling around on the ground, not turning your head and scratching your beard against your shirt or coat collar, or not wearing any noisy clothing. Being quiet means being absolutely quiet. It's also extremely important for the hunter to remain as motionless as possible. These varmints have pretty good eyesight, and they'll pick you out if you move around a lot. Most hunters don't know what motionless means either. If you're going to be a very successful predator caller, you're going to have to learn what it means to be quiet and not move. When you blow on a predator call, other than the quiet coaxer call, you can expect that the sounds are going to carry at least a mile away. I can hear these sounds from my Jackrabbit distress call or Cottontail distress call. I can hear them myself at almost a mile away. Now, the predatory animals such as fox and coyotes, I think, can easily hear them out beyond 2 miles away. And so keep that in mind when you're calling. The closer you approach the position of an animal, the higher the likelihood that he'll detect something's wrong and he'll be reluctant to respond to your calling efforts. Remember, the important point is that you don't want the animal to know that you're out there. You have to learn to be real sneaky. These critters that you're going to be calling are pretty sharp, and you're going to have to be real sharp and sneaky yourself if you're going to fool many of them. If you've done a good job in being quiet when setting up at your stand, it shouldn't surprise you to have an animal respond within a matter of seconds from the time you first start calling. These are the animals that were very close and you succeeded in not scaring them off. But on the average, the animals that come into your calls will do so from quite some distance away, and it'll take several minutes or more for them to complete their approach to your position. Now, normally we drive in a pickup truck from one calling stand or location to the next. Now, these places are usually at least a mile apart. Generally, I just plan on driving to the next good place to call from. Now, the next good place may be a mile away, or it may be several miles. Don't pay so much attention to the distance as in the area you're calling. Just drive until you get to a good place to call from. Now, some guys like to walk in a large area and call every hour or so, but you'll cover a lot more country if you drive in a pickup truck. Park your vehicle so that it's hidden from the animals you intend to call. Now, we usually park our trucks behind a small hill and then walk over the top or around the side of the hill to a good place to call from. Walking a long way from your vehicle to a stand is great exercise, but it's time-consuming and not necessary. A good reasonable distance from your vehicle to where you set up at your stand is about 100 yards. 200 yards isn't bad. The distance is not as important as whether your vehicle can be seen by an approaching animal. Be sure to park your vehicle over a hill or a rise, or hide it behind some trees or some bushes. If it can't be seen by an approaching animal, you'll be in good shape, no matter how far it is from your calling stand. Calling predators is a game of numbers. The more places that you attempt to call, or the more stands that you make, the greater your chances are for success. I want to encourage you to make as many different stands during the day's hunting as you possibly can. Now, I normally make between 10 and 12 stands between sunup and noon, and as many again between noon and dark if I call all day long. If I find myself in an exceptionally good hunting area, I may average calling in nearly one animal for every stand that I make. In a reasonably good area, I will commonly average calling one animal for every 2 stands that I make. In an area with fewer animals, I may only call in 1 or 2 animals after calling all day long. So it depends on the area you're calling. I think what you need to do is keep some records of your success when you're out predator calling. Record the number of stands you make and the number of animals that respond to your calling efforts. If you're calling one animal for every 3 or 4 different stands that you make, I think you're doing pretty good. Then on the contrary, if you're only calling one animal every 3 or 4 days of calling effort, you're either doing something wrong or you're in an area where there are not very many varmints. So keep some records so you have some history of your calling experiences. The more dominant, aggressive animals are the animals that most often respond to your calling efforts first. The young, less aggressive animals are more timid or more cautious, and they're more afraid to approach you. So typically what we call are the more aggressive, dominant animals. One of the most frequent conversations that I have are with hunters who tell me they've been out calling for 3 or 4 days without any luck. And they want to know what might be the problem. Well, the first thing I do is I ask them how many stands they've made. And I often hear that they've made only 1 or 2 stands for each day of calling because they didn't have time to call more than 1 or 2 spots. What they're telling me is they haven't called very much, and they've only tried calling from 3 or 4 stands without any luck. Remember, if I go calling for 4 days, it's likely that I will have called from well over 50 different stands. Remember, this is a game of numbers. The probability that I will have some luck is over 10 times greater than the hunter who only calls 1 stand a day. I would expect your best results in predator calling to be in the months of September, October, and November. So don't wait until after elk and deer seasons are over before you go out blowing on your predator calls. Plan to do some predator hunting early in the season, and I think what you'll find is some pretty spectacular results. Another great aspect of predator hunting is to combine it with your other hunting sports. When we go elk and deer hunting in the fall, we always spend some time out predator calling. Our success predator calling adds a lot of enjoyment to our other hunting activities. If you harvest a deer or elk and you have some extra time left over, you'll have an excellent opportunity to do some predator calling. One thing that we need to talk about is the importance of a watch when you're out calling. I consider a watch in predator calling one of the tools that you need to have. So before you start calling at a stand, check your watch and see what time it is. And do your arithmetic, add 10 or 15 minutes to that time, and that's how long you want to stay there. So after you've been calling for a while, check your watch. If you've been there 12 or 15 minutes without any luck, move on to your next stand. When you're ready to move on to your next stand, don't waste any time. Hustle back to your pickup, get in your truck, and head down the road and get to your next stand as quick as you can. It just you're going to be a lot more successful if you spend your time out calling predators rather than walking back and forth between your truck or driving to your stands. So if you space your stands a mile or two apart, you get up from one stand, you hustle to your next one. It won't take you just a few minutes to get to your next stand where you can start calling again. Let me talk to you about camouflage clothes for a minute. I don't think the specific camo pattern that you choose is that important. I think the main thing is that the basic colors match your surrounding country. If you're calling in the snow in the winter, of course, white's going to work for you. If we're calling other places during the rest of the year, I don't think the camo pattern or the specific color is that critical. Now you may choose, if you're calling in dry country, choose a desert camo pattern like this jacket I've got on. I think just a plain old tan or brown shirt like this will work for you. If you're calling in heavily forest areas, some traditional woodland pattern like this jacket works really good. Here's a new pattern that's really nice to look at. This is a true leaf pattern that Kelly Cooper made and sent me this shirt, and I really like this particular pattern. I mean, if you hold it up against these rocks that we're around, you'll find that it matches these rocks pretty good. Even though it's called true leaf, it breaks up the pattern of the shirt. So in choosing camouflage patterns, I don't think the specific pattern that you choose is that critical, just that generally the colors match the surrounding that you're in. There are a lot of people in the country, particularly in Texas, who like to go out and do their predator calling at night. And what they do is they go out with good spotlights with red lenses, and the red beam tends not to spook any varmints. And you go out and you do basically the same techniques that we do in the daytime, except you do it at night. And what you do is you shine the lens back and forth over the area you're calling, occasionally while you're calling, to search for an animal that's approaching you. The rest of the time you keep the beam up in the air. While you're calling, every few minutes, set the light beam down across the area and scan the area with the red beam. You'll be surprised at how far away the eyes of these varmints reflect this light. You won't even see the beam of light yourself, but you'll see the reflection from the animal's eyes that are approaching. When you're out predator calling, you should pay attention to the birds in the area. Birds will commonly alert you to the approach of a nearby predator. Hawks, crows, and ravens commonly follow the predators. I also believe that the predators watch and are attracted to the noise that these birds make. So keep a watch out for them. If you're calling and attracting the birds with the predator call sounds that you're making, you can assume that you're calling correctly. In choosing an area to call, first go out and scout several different locations and check for the amount of tracks and sign. Look for good habitat, which includes good sources of food and water. These animals spend a lot of time around available water, so always check water holes for tracks and sign. For morning hunting, travel and call from east to west. For afternoon and evening hunting, travel and call from west to east. This keeps the sun in the eyes of the animals that will be approaching you. Find a place you can sit down with a good view of the surrounding area. Again, don't waste time calling from a stand that doesn't provide you a good view. Now, I prefer to sit with my back against a rock, a tree, or a bush. And always try to sit in the shade if you can. Avoid sitting behind a bush. In front is always better, so there's nothing blocking your view of the area. For best luck calling, you should know the location of all your stands prior to your hunt. That way you don't waste time looking for good stands or calling from poor locations. After you arrive at your stand, keep quiet for a couple minutes before calling. We refer to this quiet time as letting things settle down. Then start calling with a series of loud distress cries. After the first series, stop making any noise and just sit and wait motionless. Watch the surrounding area closely for any movement. If you haven't seen any movement after 2 or 3 minutes, blow another series of distress cries. Make this second series with a little less volume than the first. Then, watch the surrounding area again for a couple minutes. And continue this procedure until you've given the local varmints plenty of time to respond. If you're calling coyotes, 12 to 15 minutes at a stand is plenty enough time to wait to see some results. If after 12 or 15 minutes you haven't got a coyote to approach you, then give it up there and move on to another place. Now, bobcats and mountain lions may require an hour or more to complete their slow, cautious approach to your positions. For bears, you just never know. Sometimes they'll come running in within a minute, and other times it may take them up to an hour. After you call a fox, bobcat, or coyote, and you take a shot, don't just get up. Immediately start calling with another series of distress cries, and continue calling at that same stand for another 5 or 10 minutes. You will very often call in more than one animal at a stand. When you're ready to move on to your next stand, don't waste any time. Hustle back to your pickup, get in your truck, and head down the road and get to your next stand as quick as you can. You're going to be a lot more successful if you spend your time out calling predators rather than walking back and forth between your truck or driving to your stands. So if you space your stands a mile or two apart, you get up from one stand, you hustle to your next one. It won't take you just a few minutes to get to your next stand where you can start calling again. Now let's review some of the predator calls that I manufacture here in Santa Fe. The first one I want to talk about is my model AP1 rodent coaxer call. Now, it's a short-barreled call. It's not designed for long-range calling, and it's got a quiet voice to it. You use rodent coaxer calls to primarily bring an animal in that's on his way in already, and you want to switch from a loud volume call to a softer volume call. Or you can use coaxer calls to bring in an animal such as a coyote or a fox or something that's hung up out 200 or 300 yards, and you want to coax him in a little bit closer. That's the primary purpose of these calls. They're also very effective for calling bobcats and fox in brushy country, in river bottoms and creek bottoms, where you're not trying to call great distances like you are with the louder calls. Now let me demonstrate this one to you. This is how I blow on a coaxer call. And as you get animals in closer to you, you can cover your hand over the end of the barrel to muffle the sound and make it even quieter. If you want to make it quieter yet, when the animals are getting really close, then you point it to the ground like this. Now, that's how I blow a coaxer call. And these are pretty handy calls to have along on your hunts. The next call I'll talk about is a model AP2 Cottontail call. You notice my AP series of calls is made out of camouflage rubber. They're soft. They don't reflect sunlight. They don't bang around on your other equipment to give away your position in there. They're very easy to maintain. You can pull them apart easy, open them up, take the mouthpiece out, take the cap off, and the reed is right there. You can change reeds real simply with these calls. The reeds are small vibrating metal reeds. They vibrate, and over a period of time, the metal will fatigue and wear out like any vibrating metal. And so it's a good idea to have some extra replacement reeds with you, and you can quickly switch and put in a new reed if your reed happens to wear out while you're out hunting. Let me demonstrate the sounds that I make with an AP2 Cottontail call. Now, I particularly like the high breaking sounds that you can make from this call. And I do it like this. I put my hand over the end of the call barrel like I do on the other models, and I do that to give it a more realistic sound. I can get more variation in the sounds by changing how much I muffle the end of the barrel with my hand. I like to produce a real erratic sound when I blow on these calls, from the real high-pitched breaking sounds to a lower, coarser sound. And I find that that's much more effective for getting animals to approach you. That's a much more effective sound to make. Let me show you again. Let me make a series of calls for you. Pretty effective sound for calling most all predators. It wouldn't surprise me if I had a coyote come run up the canyon this morning with the sounds that we're making. Now, the next call I want to talk about is my AP3 Jackrabbit in Distress call. This is a long barrel call. If you look in the barrels of these calls, you'll find that the barrels are stepped, different diameters in the center of the barrels, and there's a reason for that. Each different diameter amplifies the sounds and the frequencies, so that's why they're stepped on the interior of the barrels. This is a particularly loud call, long-range call. And as I may have mentioned, when I use a Jackrabbit distress call, I want the sounds to have a certain degree of coarseness to them, a raspiness in the sound. We find that's a real effective type of sound to call predators with, particularly coyotes. Now let me demonstrate this call for you. This is how I blow on a Jackrabbit distress call. Now, can you hear the raspiness of that sound? Like this. I try to make it as erratic as I can. And when I blow on Jackrabbit calls, when I first sit down on the stand and start blowing, I blow it pretty loud. Like this, I put a lot of air and a lot of force to it, to the sound. And I blow these calls from my diaphragm. Maybe you can tell I put a lot of effort in blowing these calls. I try to make them pretty loud. And I can tell you from experience and having measured the volume of these calls that that's about 112 to 115 decibels, so it's pretty loud. When I blow on these predator calls, typically I make screams and cries. And let me demonstrate some screams and cries to you with my model AP5, which is our Snowshoe Hare call. A Snowshoe Hare is a large animal similar to a jackrabbit and has a lower voice to it. And let me demonstrate some screams and cries, which is typically what what I blow as part of a series of distress cries. First, I'll make some screams for you. Those are the screams. Okay, now these are the cries. The snowshoe hare call is like the coarse cottontail. It's also a double reeded call. So there's a fine raspiness to this call here. Now, when I make these distress sounds, what I like to do is I like to make them erratically, and I mix up the screams and the cries. So let me show you that. Well, first, I'll show you again some screams. And now some cries. Okay, now let's mix it up and make an erratic series of calls. An erratic series of calls. And that's my AP5 Snowshoe Hare distress call. Okay, the next two calls I want to demonstrate for you are designed for more experienced predator callers, for people that have had a little more experience and want to control or have more control of the sounds themselves. Now this particular call is my AP6. We call it a variable predator call. That's because you can bite on the mouthpiece, and where you bite on the mouthpiece, how hard you bite on it and how hard you blow, you control the sounds that come out of this call. It's not a pre-tuned call. And you can make a wide variety of sounds with an AP6 variable predator. You can make high-pitched rodent coaxer sounds. You can make cottontail distress sounds and jackrabbit, the low-coarse jackrabbit distress sounds, all with an AP6 variable predator. This is one of my favorite calls. It'll take you a little practice to learn how to do it right, to get the sounds that you want to come out of it. But once you do, I think you'll like the call. The animals are really responsive to the sounds of this call. And because I can bite down and change the pitches of the call quite rapidly, I can make these erratic sounds that I've been telling you that I really prefer to make. And so let me demonstrate the AP6 variable. Now this is normally how I blow it when I'm trying to call predators. See, there's quite a difference in the sounds that I get out of it. Let me demonstrate. If I bite toward the end of this call, like here, the end of the mouthpiece, I can get a higher pitched sound. As I bite closer to the barrel on it, I get lower pitched sounds. That's one way to change the sound. The tighter or more pressure I put on the two sides of the mouthpiece and close down on the reed, the more I'm closed down on the reed, the higher pitch I get. The more opened up the mouthpiece is, the lower pitch you get. The lower and coarser, more raspy sound you get. Let's bite hard now toward the end, and I'll show you how to make a high-pitched sound. Now I'll let up a little bit on it and make a lower, coarser sound. High. Low sound. Real effective call. You can change and control the volume of these calls depending on how much air you force through them. So again, it's my AP6 variable predator call. I think you'll like this call. Very productive call. Now, the next call I want to talk about is my AP7 open reed predator call. Now, we call it an open reed predator call because the reed is exposed. It's subject to being damaged. You have to be careful with the call. You could bend the reed and the call won't function properly. They're mylar reeds, which are plastic reeds. If you have a problem with the reed, or if you accidentally bend it, you need to know that you can take this call apart very easily. Just pop the mouthpiece out, and there's the reed. If you bend the reed or damage the reed, all you need to do is stick it in a cup of hot water. If you're out in camp and hunting camp and you do that, stick it in a cup of hot coffee, lay it on a flat surface, and it'll straighten itself out and you'll be back in business. It's that quick to change the reed on this call. It locks into place. You can't mess up. There's only one way it can fit in the mouthpiece. There's locking pins. Simple to take apart and put together. Now the AP7 open reed predator call was designed to be able to control the sounds with your teeth or your lips. And it's a pretty versatile call. You can make rabbit distress sounds with this call, or you can make coyote pup whines with the call. And let me demonstrate some of these for you. First, let's make some distress sounds. Now there's a lot of hunters in the Midwest, in the northern states, that like to use open reed predator calls. If they're going out calling where it's cold, 15, 20, 25, or 30 below zero when they're out hunting, any game call will develop or build up some moisture on it, and the moisture can freeze and stick the reeds. Well, in an open reed call, you can keep the reed dry, and they tend not to freeze up like some other reeds will in real cold weather. Now let me demonstrate with you some coyote pup whines, like an injured coyote pup with this call. And these coyote pup whines are pretty effective for attracting coyotes, particularly call-wise coyotes and coyotes that are hung up several hundred yards away. You can do that with this call. You can make coyote pup howls with it. Let me make a little coyote howl with this call, like this. Real high-pitched howl, like a young coyote. The last of my AP series of predator calls I want to show you is my model AP8. Now it's a little hand-operated call. It has a bellows on the outside of it. It's got a small rodent coaxer reed on the inside. And you operate this call with your hand, and you pump on the bellows like this. You make erratic sounds. We call this our special hand coaxer call. Now, when I first made this call, my personal opinion of the call was it was kind of a silly little toy. And then I went out and I tried it, and I found that it was a real effective call, and so I've changed my opinion on the call. This it's quite an effective little call. You can make real fast, erratic sounds with the call like that. Now, my dogs at the house, anytime my dogs see me pick up any kind of game call, typically they head the other way. They've heard enough calls in their lifetimes. They don't like to hear any more. But if I pick up my little special hand coaxer call, they are jumping up in my lap trying to get it. So that should be some indication that that's an attractive sound to canines. I think you'll find it a real effective little call. Okay, other than our AP series of camouflaged rubber predator calls, we also make a series of hardwood walnut calls that we make out of gunstock walnut. These are really beautiful calls for hunters who like the traditional wooden game calls. It has a mouthpiece that'll pop out of the barrel, and the metal reed is wedged into the mouthpiece. You can pull it out and change the reeds this way. and force them back in. It's a pressure fit in the barrel. Put a little pressure on it. It'll stay there. With any game calls that use 2 wood parts, it's a good idea to occasionally check them and make sure they get tight, stay tight. Wood has a tendency to expand and contract with different temperatures and humidity. So I'd encourage you, using any wooden game calls, to occasionally check the tightness of the mouthpiece in the barrel. Let me demonstrate. This was my VG3, one of my original varmint getter calls. It's a Jackrabbit distress voice in it. And this is how I blow this. You'll find it particularly low pitched and a coarse call. It's a dynamite call for calling coyotes. So those of you who like the traditional walnut predator calls, I think you'll like our varmint getter, our VG series of predator calls. Well, I hope some of the tips I've given you will make your next predator hunt a great success. Before I go, I'd like to remind you to respect the rights of private property owners, be a good sportsman, and above all, be careful with your firearms and other weapons. Adios, y que te vaya bien en la casada.
For a free color catalog of the Sceery line of professional game calls, other audio and videotapes, or for information on hunting seminars, phone or write the E.J. Sceery Company in Santa Fe, New Mexico. E.J. Sceery Company, P.O. Box 6520, Santa Fe, New Mexico, 87502-6520, or phone toll free, 1-800-327-4322.